welcome to Afrikindness Podcast, where we delve into important conversations that celebrate African excellence, kindness, and unity. I am your host, Peace George, and today's episode is titled Unveiling the Truth, Stereotypes, and Misconceptions. And together we will explore the impact of stereotypes on African identity and discuss ways to challenge and overcome them. Joining me here are two esteemed guests, Dr. Ollie Folayan and Isabella Mascarenhas. Welcome. Hi.
Hey, Peace. Lovely to be here.
Nice to meet you. Isabella, I hope I pronounced your last name right.
That was pretty good.
Good. Thank you.
Mascarenhas, but yeah, close.
Thank you so much. So good to have you both here. So we're going to go on with the introductions. Isabella, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself first and let the audience get to know you. We've been looking forward to this day. So welcome. And then Dr. Folayan is going to take it from there. Go ahead, Isabella.
Sure. So everybody as a starting point calls me Is. I am an interesting one in terms of heritage, where I come from. My family is originally from Southwest India, ex-Portuguese colony, hence my very Portuguese name. But I was brought up in Zambia for the first few years of my life. And my father was born and brought up in Uganda. So I have a very strong affiliation with a few different African countries. And my husband is Black Jamaican. And of course, we've done all sorts of research into where his roots may go back to. So rather passionate on this topic. So very happy to be here.
Oh, wow. Nice to have you also. Thank you. Dr. Ollie?
Oh, well, I'll be very, very keen to explore those and to find out a bit more. Yeah, I'm Ollie Folayan. I'm a chemical engineer by background, live and work in Aberdeen. I am Nigerian. I usually say Nigeria via London, but yes, Nigeria nonetheless, of the Yoruba variety. So really interested and excited to be here and grateful to have been invited again on this fantastic Afrikindness podcast.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Thank you for coming back. We love to have you. All right. So, to break the ice, let's delve into the concept of African identity. As in the last podcast, we talked about this, so I wanted to kind of flow into this new one we're going into. So how would you define the African identity, Isabella?
For the purposes of the video, I am jotting things down as we go along because I have a lot of thoughts bobbling around in my head. When I hear, clearly I can't identify as African, even though I have had lots of stints in various parts. But when I hear African, I automatically think intelligence, innovation, joy, vibrancy, richness of culture, huge diversity. I mean, we say African, but within Africa, there are so many different countries and so many different cultures and dialects. And so, yeah, those are the immediate words that come to my mind when I hear African.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Intelligence. Oh. Mm-hmm. Isabella, you should be my new best friend, really.
Yeah.
Wow, thank you so much for that. So proud. I'm so proud of my heritage. Thank you. Right, so Dr. Ollie, considering the vast cultural, linguistic, and historical diversity that Isabella has talked about, what does it mean to you, the African identity?
I think of the African identity primarily through stories. And so when I think of African identity, I think of all of the folklore, the music, and so many of those gems and just observations of the world that are coming through the African culture. The last time we were looking at this and we were discussing it, and I remember there's a Yoruba proverb that says, "Where will the person who stole the king's trumpet blow it?" And I remember thinking,
Yoruba.
And I remember thinking that is, it just contains this reservoir of incredible wisdom held by the people who are surrounded by the world's largest natural resources and the world's most diverse people, as Isabella said, and also the world's most resilient people against centuries of oppression. And from that whole process has come a set of stories which can pretty much apply in any situation. So when I think of the African identity, I think of stories, and those powerful stories that we have told ourselves for years. I also think about the things that have gotten in the way of those stories, and some of the, what Chimamanda Adichie refers to as the danger of a single story. So stories versus the story. And that's what I think about when I think of the African identity.
Oh, wow. Okay, we're getting started. I love it. Thank you so much. Thank you both for your insightful perspectives. I love them. Now let's delve into this next segment where we have to explore the stereotypes and the African identity just side by side. So to set that stage, let me paint a picture for us. So, this will give us a background. Picture this busy street in London, bustling with people from various backgrounds, right? Among them, we see a man elegantly dressed in his traditional attire, right? And just radiating in this cultural pride. If I had to call that man an African, what can you picture? Give me a description of this man. If I have said this man I just talked about is an African man, what picture do you have right now? Isabella?
No. I have to touch on first shiny, beautiful skin, right? We shine, and particularly when we're all oiled up and looking pretty, we shine. The fabric that I envisage his traditional dress being, all the colour, beautiful patterns, rich fabrics, royalty, we carry, Africans carry themselves with a real regalness when they're wearing traditional dress. So that's what happens in my mind on that particular image.
Yes.
Wow. Thank you, Isabel. Dr. Ollie?
Yeah, I completely resonate with that. I always remember my wedding, and we had the church ceremony, and people usually say when you see your wife on the wedding day you feel kind of wow, and yeah, it was wow, but I certainly felt a lot more when she came out in her Nigerian outfit. I just thought that was a moment for me in the wedding. It was just fantastic. So when I picture this guy, I picture color, pride, I picture a big smile as well, because generally the African mentality it really embodies that sense that regardless of what's happening, even when things are difficult, sometimes so much so that the great Fela Kuti referred to it as he talked about suffering and smiling, because ultimately that African smile is something that we always wear. So that's the other thing I think of when I see this man.
Wow. Thank you for that. So back to you, Isabel. Something that you said that really struck me. You said shiny skin. You didn't say black skin. Why?
The tones. How many incredible skin tones, right from super fair skin through to what I like to call blackety black. You can't put a colour on it, I don't think. We're back to that diversity of different skin tones just within the African continent. You can't. I don't immediately think of a shade per se.
Wow. Thank you so much, because I believe that lots of people think when they think of their Africanness, they think it's the skin color. So I want us to just discuss that a bit, because when I thought of, well, before you all started to talk, actually, I've been thinking, okay, there are lots of people who are African, but they're not dark skinned. But while I was growing up, because I grew up in Nigeria, before we came out here, and what we thought was that everyone called African had to have the dark skin. So I want us to talk about this in case there's someone, and there are lots of identity crises, to be honest. There's so many people who do not look like me, and they're not even accepted as Africans. I want us to talk about that. What do you think about accepting someone who is in dark skin as African? Because I've heard lots of Africans even speaking to them like, you can't be African, you don't have a dark skin. Let's discuss that. Dr. Ollie, and then Isabella.
Yeah, there's certainly a long history of that. And, we spoke earlier about stories, and we said there are the African stories, and then there is the story, the thing that has been imposed. And, for 500 years, people were told, and it all started, it was all imported, all started in a situation where, in order to divide, if you like, the what was then Irish indentured servants working in Virginia, there was a particular rebellion called Bacon's Rebellion, in which a lot of these black black indentured workers, were uniting with their Irish indentured workers. And in order to create a kind of separation between these classes, they created this scenario. It's one of the reasons why this idea of skin color or race doesn't really come up, even in the dictionary, in relation to skin tones, until around the 17th century, so much later. And so and they made that distinction almost as a way of saying to these white poor people, if you like, that you may be poor, but at least you're not black. And it created this division between the races. It has always been a myth. It has always been a sociological, psychological, or physiological myth that there is anything much more significant within between our skin tones. But that created a narrative that has been perpetuated over the years. It's permeated through our theology, our history, our pop culture, so much so that we have come to define beauty by its proximity to whiteness. And it is that sense of a narrative that has created this sense, and I remember a mother talking about their child getting back home from school in Perth and grabbing a sponge and trying to rub off their skin because they had been told that it was ugly. And it was only when they went on a trip to Nigeria, saw other people, said, oh, there are lots of people like me. And this young girl came back to Scotland with a little bit more of a pep in her step, because she suddenly saw that she was beautiful as well. But it is those stories that have been told, and they become so hegemonic in our popular culture because they come to be accepted. And that is the reason why skin color has the significance it has. And unfortunately, the African context has meant that a lot of people don't see the beauty in themselves.
That's very deep. Well, I agree with you. Isabella, go ahead.
Yeah, bang on, Ollie. That was exactly what I was thinking. And I think for me, it comes back to decolonizing our own mindsets, right? We all know, and I think we've already touched on the divide and conquer further back in the conversation. They did a number on our minds as well, right? And this is, for me, is one of the reasons why I care about this a lot, is through what Ollie's talking about. Indians were brought into the mix as well. So, Africans and Indians have way more in common than they like to discuss and believe. There's still this kind of weird segregation between us, and that goes back to colonialism. And there is still this real kind of anti-blackness in the Indian and Asian community, and I am trying to expunge that from myself because I was raised with some of those stories in my family. But yeah, it is absolutely about decolonizing our mindset, because, you know, even in the Indian community, there is still this, you know, the fairer you are, the more beautiful. And I try to flip that completely on its head, because I like to think that, you know, the darker the berry, the sweeter the fruit. We all know that saying as well, right? So yeah, it is. It's very much a mindset thing that is still within us from centuries and centuries of having that proximity to whiteness, that European features are more beautiful, drummed into our heads by the people who were enslaving and taken over our countries, right?
That's right.
Wow. Thank you for that. This is going quite well. Thank you so much. Wow. You know, there's so many truths that we haven't even unveiled yet, and, you know, we're doing so well. Thank you so much. I'm very emotional here already. And I don't even know why. Because the more you dig into this, the more you realize that even the way we perceive ourselves, there's something wrong with that, you know. So let's keep it going. All right, so let's go back to this guy. So we've clothed this guy. Now we know he has a shiny skin, right? This London guy. So I want you to think about the people around this guy, the passers-by. What are the assumptions that they may have about his background and all of that? Dr. Ollie? So let's start. We're going into stereotype now. So I want you to define it, and then look at this guy, and let's begin to put it on him. What do you think the people around him, now that we know he's African, he has shiny skin, and we can tell by the attire that he's putting on, what are the assumptions about him? What would you say they are?
So a lot of the assumptions that would be made about him will come from popular culture. So there is an element to which there is a sort of exoticization of the African, and there's a tendency that the first reaction people may have may be a sense of, here is a character of fun. And, you know, it all kind of harks back to a time when, people like that would then be associated with some sort of exhibition. So he may be expected to be a character of fun, and that is when we're looking at it in a more generous way. What is more likely to happen, though, and we know this from various research that's been done, is that there will be a product of certain kinds of structural relationships that are associated with him, and many of which are generally around this idea of perceived socioeconomic status and perceived interdependability, so the extent to which we can work with this person. And it is those two factors that generally generate this stereotype content that generally revolves around warmth and competence. So there is a tendency, depending on the context, that person may be seen as somebody that either is as relatively incompetent, and, you know, this is what the models like the Susan Fisk model shows, or somebody who is less warm, who's somebody who they can't necessarily do business with. The fact that he's a man may mean that people may attach certain kinds of other stereotypes to this person around perhaps being a little bit aggressive and so on. And so on the positive side, he may be seen as a character of fun, especially since he's dressed in this wonderful opulent outfit. But if they were ever to then sit down and have a discussion, there might be other stereotypes around competence and warmth that may then inform the way that they relate.
Oh, wow. Thank you for that. I'm also thinking, you've created this picture. I didn't even know you were going to take it this far, Dr. Ollie, honestly. So,
Right.
and you talked about the generous part of it, the negative part of it. I'm also thinking, because of this thing we have in America, right? They see this Black person and they're running, especially the men. So I'm thinking in London, they're probably even thinking immigrants, refugee, and then start to, so let's go. So yes, Isabella. The way you said Isabella.
Well, I was going to try and do what Ollie did, but I have a direct experience that I can relate here. So not on a London street, but my sister-in-law is Serbian, right? And we went over to Serbia for my brother and sister-in-law's wedding. And I wore full sari to the wedding, and my husband wore a beautiful African suit. And the two of us were walking through Belgrade city centre, and I'm relating this story because I think they are actually a lot more open and honestly curious over there about race-related issues, whereas here people will think things and not necessarily say them. But yeah, a couple of Serbians literally came up to us and went, "How do you guys afford to dress like that?" Because from what they see from people of colour, they are predominantly Romani gypsies in that part of the world. They are, very sadly, the poorest of the poor. And so in their mindset, they went, hang on a minute, here's a Black man and a brown woman. They associated us with the only people of colour that they're familiar with, and immediately went, you should be poor. How can you afford to look like that? Now, I envisage that similar things happen in people's minds over here when they see us flourishing or looking particularly slick or sharp.
Wow.
And I think that what sits behind that, again, is all that history, right? All these subconscious and very conscious messages that have been fed to them over the years of what they should believe an African is. The images that you see on the telly, that they feed you on the telly of Africa as being a poor country with no, or country, actually, that was a mistake, but a Freudian slip, because that is how a lot of them think of it, about Africa as a country as opposed to a continent.
True.
I think that those things all sit behind that thought of, how do you look like that? How do you look successful and doing well? And Ollie, I think you touched on something earlier also, a painful and hard topic, but one that has to be brought into the conversation, that I do still think that there is this little corner of a lot of minds of Caucasian European people that they still see Black people as quote unquote slaves, right? How do you get from that to this?
Exactly. Well, you're right. I did that piece because language matters, right?
They are not slaves; they were enslaved, and that is a massive difference.
Yes.
So
yes, absolutely. There's still that tendency to, as you say, associate people of African descent primarily with poverty and with incompetence, because quite a lot of people will look at the African continent, look at a group of people who are surrounded by the world's largest resources but are also the world's poorest, and they say, surely there is a correlation between the two. The people in that continent must be incompetent for them to be surrounded by such wealth but not be able to govern themselves. And sometimes that actually, I was sitting here in Aberdeen in a works context when somebody who I had worked with for at least 2 years up to that point started to advance some very scientifically racist arguments to suggest that people of African descent were less intelligent. And I found out he'd been part of a book club where they were reading books, certain books, which reaffirmed those beliefs. Of course, none of those things were ever uttered openly. But as Isabella said, quite often these are the thoughts that are still in the mind. So there is almost a need for a decolonization of all minds, because there's that tendency for people to think these myths that just aren't true.
Wow. Thank you very much for that. Dr. Ollie, I do agree with you. Circling back to what Isabella said, I just thought of this now. The fact that they associate Africans with poverty, and at the same time, truly, I've been to some places where people have told me, why do your people dress like that? Or, once they hear that I'm Nigerian, they go, why do you people spend so much money? So how do we go from not having it to spending a lot? And I'm thinking that, do you think that Africans, in the way, let me say, in the way they spend or in the way they dress or what we spend money on? There was this day my friends and I were, trying to talk about the kind of things that we buy. And most of the time, at least I know some of my mates who will rather go for things that have, like they want to buy Gucci. They don't want the smaller logos. They want the Gucci. So what's the... Do you think that this narrative of the poor could be driving us that way, causing this identity crisis? Hence, we're trying to just latch on anything that just to show who we are, rather than just sit back and let people find out who we are. So this show that we have, because I think as an African that we
Absolutely.
have this show, sincerely, and I always think, okay, you see a typical one who would rather not have money in the bank, but have everything on gold, jewelry. Do you think that this narrative of poverty and this other side of being so exotic and extravagant, do you think there's a correlation? This is me. I mean, I don't know. I didn't do any research. But I'm just thinking, are we trying to prove ourselves? Is there something we're trying to prove?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to jump in there, but I really do think that nothing speaks loudly of the poverty of our situation than our obsession with looking prosperous or being that ostentation. And I think a lot of it comes from, it's not just with wealth. I was reflecting on this with someone just about an hour ago. There is a tendency that when you work, and a lot of women identify with this as well as a lot of people of color. When you're in a situation where you fear that people may think because of this, that, and the other, you are this, that, and the other, you want to overcompensate by, you may want to show, for example, how competent you are in the workplace. And, a lot of that can often be driven by insecurity. But then there's also this issue around wealth. And I think, the old comedian Ava Vidal said that it says, how we heard about the way that people came along and took our silver and gold. It says, I was watching the rap videos and I realized we got it all back. But I think there is certainly something in that.
Wow, thank you very much. Yes, Isabella, let's talk about this other lady. Okay, in a professional environment, let's imagine this lady, African woman, determined and confident in her abilities, but she faces some sort of stereotypes. So I want you to start first by defining stereotype. And then, with this picture of this lady, what sort of things do you think she might be facing? What sort of challenges do you think she might be facing at her workplace?
Oh, this one's quite close to home. We can't talk about this without the perception of the angry black woman, right?
Yeah.
We also can't talk about this without acknowledging that Black African women are very often some of the most qualified women in the workplace, but are often viewed as being not good enough for certain jobs, despite the fact that they hold 2, 3, 4 degrees, whatever it is. Right?
Wow.
I think those are two massive ones, particularly for women of colour, and even more so for Black women. You know the old adage that a white man can say something and he's perceived as assertive and opinionated, and those are already positive qualities. But then a Black woman says the same things, and she's angry, she's pointy, she's aggressive. These are some of the challenges that Black women go through all the time, right? You come up with an idea, you phrase it one way, it doesn't land. Someone on the other side of the table says exactly the same thing in a slightly different way, and they go, "Oh, amazing idea, let's do that." It's all of that stuff on a regular, microaggressions, gaslighting, all of that, left, right, and centre, all day, every day. That is what I think of as the experience and the challenges of a Black woman in the workplace.
Wow, thank you. So that being said, how would you define stereotypes?
Is that to me still?
Yes, to you still, Isabella.
Well, all of those things that I just said are stereotypes, right? They're not true. They're how they're perceived. I didn't even touch on hair. The perception of what is and isn't professional. They're just multiple challenges that they have, and it breaks my heart to watch it, because actually if you just got over all of that stuff and let them just get on with their jobs, they'd be smashing it out the park. But they have all these other things to think about and deal with, and 9 times out of 10 they're still smashing it out the park despite having to deal with all of those things. So yeah, I think all those things that we just talked about are stereotypes, unfair and unreasonable stereotypes.
Thank you, Isabella. Wow, that hit close to home, because I've experienced this myself. Where I had even walked into a place. Somebody was, it was an interview, and I walked in there, and they said to me, "What are you doing? Are you Peace George?" I said, "Yeah, I'm Peace George." They're like, "Are you sure you're Peace George?"
Yeah, pretty positive.
Said, "Yes, I'm sure. What do you have a problem with how this Peace George looks?" And the lady said, "Oh, no, have your seat." So we went on and on like that. But I kept asking her, "Do you have a problem with my look and the name?" So I already know that I got the job, because they had to prove themselves. So they're like, "No." So I discovered later that out of 20 people, there were just 2 Black people, and you could tell that it was the name. Because the other guy, his name sounded just like mine. Nothing gave away the Afrikindness, but and lots of things happened in that place of work. I had to resign, and so when you started to talk about this African woman, I could relate, and I'm even really trying not to remember the things that I went through. But thank you so much for that.
I don't for a second pretend or believe that my experience is anywhere close to that of a Black woman's, but I have my own challenges too, right? And the amount of times I've rocked up at places, people see my name and it sounds entirely Portuguese. They hear me on a phone call and they think she sounds really British. And then I rock up and I'm brown and they're like, "Oh, what is this? What is this? Like, who are you?" Yeah, so I've experienced some of those, and I head up our race inclusion network at work as well, and I definitely get called angry and pointy when I'm pointing out injustices, which has to be done, right? It's the right thing, but yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Ollie. What is your definition of stereotypes?
I will say that it's the stories that we have had that we then project onto the people that we see. So, and those stories have come from so many different sources. and it's just being aware of that, and it's so insidious. And the truth is, we all have those stereotypes, and we're both infected. I usually say that I wasn't born in the Federal Republic of woke utopia, because in that republic no one had any bad influences. We all have stereotypes, and but you hope that we all kind of get to a point where we are reflective enough to know when something happens that this is where it's come from. I realized some years ago that I had a particular prejudice, and I didn't realize that because I didn't realize it because my parents and men in the family had been very disparaging of this group of people. And so it took me many years later as a student at uni to realize that I had this particular prejudice. And so if we think about it in that context, there are so many of these stereotypes. But yes, stereotypes for me are the narratives, the stories that we've heard that we then project onto others.
Oh, wow. Thank you for that. Even this afternoon I was watching, I think it was Project Nightfall, and I didn't even know that I felt that way. So he said, if you think about a Filipino, what comes to mind? And everything that I've read about the Filipinos is that they are kind and they smile a lot, and that's it, nothing else. So he said, if you just thought about them as just being kind and smiling, then that's a stereotype. I was like, oh, yeah. really, you've never thought of them as being intelligent or at least anything else. And it's true, I never, because everything I've read about them has always been they're kind people. They're kind, so sometimes we don't even know. So which brings me to this question. Now, having heard all these stories about us, do you think that maybe we've accepted some of it? So,
yeah.
Go ahead, Isabella.
Oh, I'm sorry. I couldn't zip it on that.
Go ahead.
Let's go back to the hair conversation. Let's go back to the fact that one of the biggest industries in Africa and in India is skin bleaching. All of that goes back to us having absorbed some of that. Many of us have almost taken on that self-hatred that they did try to instill in us, right? And was part of the whole divide and conquer strategy. So yeah, I do think we took a lot of it on. And I think that also comes back to what we were talking about earlier with the overcompensating piece, dispelling what they thought of us, but also what they made us think of ourselves. Does that make sense?
It does.
100%. Yes.
And don't get me wrong, I completely understand for some people, wearing braids or doing their hair in a particular way is a preference, but for some people it does come back to that. The believing that natural black hair is not beautiful, because it is. It's like the most versatile hair type in the world.
Wow. We spend a lot of money buying other people's hair.
I know, but why? It's so beautiful.
Like, I'm here looking at your hair and I'm like, Isabella, you got it. Do you know how much that costs in the market?
Water face.
This is what my wife says a lot. She sees certain hair. That would make a nice lace wig.
That's what I was going to say. It's so bad that you see people and the first thing you think is, oh, wow, look at Isabella. How much do you think that hair is going to cost? It's an automatic thought.
Yeah.
It's so bad. Yeah. Whoa.
And in many ways, I actually think that because those things are a symptom of a bigger and deeper problem, I actually I'm a lot more forgiving, therefore, of any form of those expressions, perhaps knowing that I am infected with the same disease myself. And so, but I think the important thing is actually just understanding that that's what's happening. I think that's the most important thing to understand. You can't suddenly, why do most of us have a certain palate that likes certain kinds of foods that are particularly salty? Well, it's because years and years and years and years ago, we had to preserve our food using salt. And so ultimately, we've all developed a taste that if it doesn't, if it doesn't have a certain kind of something to it, we don't really want to eat it. But that's just conditioning. And somebody else with a different heritage has a different kind of conditioning. And in a way, we almost can't suddenly step out of that and expunge that. The important thing is if we realize it's there, though, we can start the journey of, we quoted Bob Marley in the first session of these that we had, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. It's like,
I have to correct us there. It was not Bob Marley that said that. It was Marcus Garvey in one of his.
There you go.
Yeah,
there you
and
go.
Marcus Garvey was also the guy that said "Africa for Africans, home and abroad."
Yes.
Wow. Wow. Well, that process of emancipation, mental emancipation. Thanks for that. Actually, I'll remember that.
Thank you.
It is the way that it is a process, and is the way that we start to get away from that sense of, and it just affects us in so many different ways. You're in the workplace. It is quite normal, if one is not careful, that the other African person who you happen to work with suddenly becomes a person you are competing with, or wanting to see yourself as a better version of. And if we understand that that's what's happening, we can start to act in the opposite spirit and against that particular thing. But as long as we know that it's there.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. Because of our time, there's still so much to talk about, right? But because of our time, we're going to round up now. But we're going to have a series too. And so this invitation is official, right? We're going to be having a series too. And we've talked about so many things. We've talked about common stereotypes, including poverty. Even Africa as a poverty-stricken continent, not just the individual now, but the continent itself. This even affects our economic potential, but I would love for us to talk about this in the second series. We've talked about, I want us to really talk about the impact. We've mentioned it, but I would love for us to really go deep into it, because I believe that some people don't even recognize it. They're so used to it. They've embraced it. And, like Isabella said, they're overcompensating. They're so used to it that they don't even know what it is, whether subtly or not. So I would love for us to really go into that. But I would love to just wrap up this episode, just wrap up this series so that we can go into the next one. But I would love for Isabella, do you have any words for anyone out there who, we talked about the African identity. I want you to just talk to any African out there who may be experiencing any form of identity crisis.
I guess the main overarching thing that I would say is that always remember that you come from excellence. And don't believe what they tell you, right? So read. Like, books equals knowledge, knowledge equals power. And reading about Africa, about various countries, about things that we take for granted over here that actually came from there, the richness of the country's resources, the phenomenal empires that existed in Africa, what Africa was called pre-colonialism. Like, there is so much to learn, and as soon as you start learning about that stuff, you will start to unravel the web of lies that have been told that lead to said stereotypes and us believing what we now believe about Africa and Africans. And the narrative that they have woven, it could not be further from the truth.
Wow, thank you for that. Dr. Ollie?
I completely just agree, resonate with everything Isabella just said. There is there is a different narrative out there, and we can start to sing a different tune. And sometimes when you try and fight against the issues, it doesn't quite work. But if you sing a different tune, and we used the Greek mythology analogy the last time, if we sing a different tune, as in start to see, just like Isabella was saying, the beauty of African culture, beauty of African music, just the different means of expression. I think that's the solution, really, to embracing again the African identity, and we start to understand finally what Africa has done for the rest of the world. Because we often talk about what was done to us, but there's so much that we have done for the rest of the world, and I don't mean working on plantations to pay to raise money for people who then paid for the machines that defined the Industrial Revolution. I'm thinking much more than that. There's so much more that we've contributed. That is that music that will hopefully drown out the other voices.
Oh wow. Thank you so much. And
sorry, just to bring it back to what Ollie first started out with his stories. When he thinks of Africa and he thinks of stories, there is a proverb, an African proverb. Of course there is. There's an African proverb for everything. That I think encapsulates what we've just talked about really beautifully. And it is that until the lion tells the story, the hunter will always be the hero. That's what's happened here, right? The hunter has woven a story about us. We're the lions. We know our true story. It's on us to find out our true story and to rectify that narrative that has been woven.
Wow.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much. Isabella, Dr. Folayan, thank you so much. So beautiful. This is a good time to even wrap this up, because after a proverb, there's nothing else to say.
Definitely. That was powerful.
That was powerful. Thank you so much. So on that note, we're going to wrap this up. What I'm going to say is keep challenging stereotypes and misconceptions. There's so many of them out there, and don't stop telling your own stories. We can pave the way for a more inclusive and equitable world as long as we don't keep quiet and we keep putting that story out there. Thank you so much. I want to thank my esteemed guests. It's been absolutely wonderful having you both. And we're not even done yet, because we have to talk about the impact of this on the continent and on the African man or woman. So please join us again next week as we continue series 2 of this particular episode. Until then, it's bye for now. Bye-bye.